Ukraine was a flawed democracy before Russia invaded. It's utterly corrupt, many ways dysfunctional, especially the elites were dysfunctional. The gas industry in Ukraine was absolutely terrible because of the corruption that it generated, the oligarch problem, a handful of people stealing the state resources. And yet Ukraine had an open public sphere and it had a parliament that functioned. And so despite its flaws, it was still a democracy. The regime in Moscow, you can't say that, Lex. It's not a comparable regime to Ukraine. You could say, oh, well, there are oligarchs in Ukraine and there are oligarchs in Russia. There's corruption in Ukraine. There's corruption in Russia. So really, what's the big difference? And the answer is, well, Ukraine had the open public sphere. Ukraine had a real parliament. Can you call Russia's Duma a real parliament? I don't think so. I don't think you can. Can you say that there were any checks whatsoever on the executive branch in Russia? Can you say that the Russian judiciary had any independence or really full level of competence, even compared to the Ukrainian judiciary, which was nothing to brag about? No, you can't say that, Lex. So we can differentiate between the very flawed, corrupt oligarchic democracy in Ukraine and the very corrupt oligarchic autocracy in Russia. I think that's a fair distinction.
Yeah, we should say that Russia and Ukraine have the great honor of being the number one and the number two most corrupt nations in Europe by many measures. But there is a fundamental difference, as you're highlighting. Russia is a corrupt autocracy. Ukraine, we can say, is a corrupt democracy. And to that level, there's a fundamental difference.
Ukraine is not murdering its own journalists in systematic fashion. If journalists are killed in Ukraine, it's a tragedy. If journalists are killed in Russia or Russian journalists are killed abroad, it's regime policy.
And the degree to which a nation is authoritarian means that it's suffocating its own spirit, its capacity to flourish. It's we're not just talking about the freedom of the press, those kinds of things, but basically all industries get suffocated, and you're no longer being able to flourish as a nation, grow the production, the GDP, the scientists, the art, the culture, all those kinds of things.
Yes, Lex, you're absolutely right. And so before the invasion, the full-blown invasion of February 2022 into Ukraine, because as you know, the war has been going on for many years at a lower level compared to what it is these days, but still a tragic war with many deaths prior to February 2022. Before this latest war, we could have said that the greatest victims of the Putin regime are Russian, domestic, that the people who are suffering the most from the Putin regime are not sitting here in New York City, but in fact are sitting there in Russia. Now, of course, with the invasion of Ukraine and really the atrocities that have been well documented and more are being investigated, we can't easily say anymore that Russians are the greatest victims of the Putin regime. But in ways other than bombing and murdering civilians, children, mothers, grandmothers, grandfathers, after you include that, then, of course, the larger number of victims of the Putin regime are not Ukrainians, but ultimately Russians. And there's how many of them now that have fled?